Hi, everyone. We're just giving it a minute and letting people file in from the waiting room. We'll get started here any second. Thanks for joining us today. Okay, it looks like most folks have filed in, so let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca DeWinter-Schmidt, the Associate Director at the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, and welcome to our investor briefing, where we're going to introduce to you two new investor guidance documents that have been released by the World Benchmarking Alliance, WBA for short, to support investors engaging with their portfolio companies on their human rights and gender performance through a series of questions and leading practice examples. These guidance documents are based on key findings from the most recent Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, CHRB for short, you may hear that acronym a lot today, and gender assessments, and identify areas where companies experience the most challenges, but also have the greatest opportunities to improve their performance on the indicators that underpin these two benchmarks. The CHRB guidance will be of particular interest to investors who are part of our coordinated corporate engagement that uses the CHRB data to engage companies who have scored 0 on human rights due diligence related indicators in the 5 high-risk sectors that are assessed. The idea being that companies need to have solid due diligence processes in place if they are to sufficiently identify their human rights related risks in order to effectively manage them. Both the investors we're going to be hearing from today are part of that CHRB coordinated engagement, and please do feel free to reach out to us if you'd like to learn more about it. Before I introduce the speakers and we get started, I wanted to share a few logistical matters. As you've probably noticed, we are being recorded. This is because we want to share out this briefing for those who are unable to attend. So please do bear that in mind if you want to remain off camera, because we're doing this as a Zoom meeting, or if you want to ask a question in the chat function later when we get to the Q&A rather than being on camera, fine. Also, if you want us to turn off the recording, we can also do that. So we want you to feel comfortable to have a very open discussion. And we will have about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the call. You can also, if you're in during the presentations, want to already pose your question, feel free to pop those into the chat function, which should be active. We do ask that you all remain on mute just to improve the quality of the call until you want to go off mute and introduce yourself and ask a question. We do have a fairly straightforward agenda today, and unfortunately, time constraints do not allow us to share the impressive bios of our speakers. So just briefly, let me tell you who we have here today with us. We have Talia Swissa, who is the Engagement Manager of Social Transformation at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and she will provide us an overview of the two guidance documents and how investors can use them in their company engagements. She is joined by two of her colleagues who are research analysts and helped develop the documents, Jill Vandewalla and Sanjini Jain. They will be available to answer questions during the Q&A. Then we'll hear from two investors, Benjamin Chakroun, an ESG analyst, human rights and ethics at Candrium, and Amy Orr, who's Director of Shareholder Engagement at Boston Common Asset Management. And they're both going to share with us some experiences and good practice examples with regards to engaging companies on their human rights and gender performance, after which we'll then go to open the floor for discussion. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Talia. Thanks so much for being with us today. I think you're still on mute, Talia.
Always starting like that. Thank you, Rebecca and Asaba, for organizing this webinar and for everyone who is attending today. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll start with a very brief introduction to the World Benchmarking Alliance for those who don't know what we do. We are a non-for-profit organization that develops open source benchmarks and methodologies to measure company performance on the Sustainable Development Goals. To do that, we developed 7 systems transformations that you can see on the screen. We assessed 2,000 of the world's most influential companies in a series of benchmarks across these transformations. So we can measure them on climate and decarbonization, digital inclusion, nature, and human rights, among other topics. And following the SDGs principles of leaving no one behind, the social transformation sits at the heart of our model. If we can move to the next slide, please. Great. So we have 3 benchmarks in the social transformation that looks at social issues. First, we have the social benchmark that assesses 2,000 companies on the fundamentals, and is set to be published in July 2024 this year, obviously. And we also have 2 catalytic topics that we cover in the social transformations. The first is human rights, and the second is gender. And we look into these topics in more depth in our gender benchmark and our corporate human rights benchmark, the CHRB. We can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll quickly introduce our 2 benchmarks that the investor guidance documents are based on, basically. So first, we have our gender benchmark that ranks 112 of the largest companies in the apparel and food sectors on supply chain and workplace indicators across 6 measurement areas that you can see on the slide. In addition to the gender benchmark, we also assessed 1,000 companies on a subset of the indicators from the gender benchmark, mostly focusing on workplace performance to get a broader understanding of the state of play on corporate performance on gender. And then we have our corporate human rights benchmark, in which we assess 230 companies across 5 sectors. We have food and agricultural products, ICT manufacturing, automotive manufacturing, extractives, and apparel. And the latest iterations focused on apparel and extractives that was published in 2023. And so far, we've had 5 benchmark iterations of the CHRB. We can move to the next slide, please. So when we publish a benchmark, we also publish individual company scorecards and rankings. Can move to the next slide. It shows some of the resources. Great. And we publish insights report and data sets. The reason I'm mentioning this is that all of these resources have been used by investors. For example, we have individual company scorecards, and we see them often being used by investors in their one-on-one engagements with companies to highlight gaps and decide what to focus their engagement on, as well as to show evidence of how companies performed on a specific topic or area. Then our data sets that you can see an example of on the screen are used for, in some cases, for voting or collective engagement to inform portfolio selection, companies for portfolio selection in some cases as well. We can move to the next slide. Great. So we realized that creating guidance documents for investors will further socialize our results by making it more accessible for investors to use our data in your engagement with companies, basically. So what do the documents include? They're based on our corporate human rights benchmark and gender benchmark findings. What we did is we translated our key findings from each of the benchmark into a set of assessment questions that are very easy to use and accessible. We wanted to make it accessible for everyone, no matter the knowledge level on human rights or gender. So under each of the key findings, there is a set of questions related to the topic for you to use in stewardship activities. And the guidance documents also include a leading practice Excel that can be used in conjunction with the assessment questions to inform users about what good disclosure looks like. We can move to the next slide. I'll share some more information. So just a bit more information on the CHRB guidance document. So the assessment questions are based on the findings from our 2022 and 2023 CHRB benchmark. So it covers the 5 sectors that we assessed. Because the CHRB has a section in the methodology dedicated to sector-specific risks, we've also added a section focusing on questions that investors could ask companies in relation to sector-specific risks. So those are also available in the CHRB investor guidance. And as I mentioned, we embedded a leading practice document in the guidance. You can see on the slide an example of one of the topics we cover in the document, stakeholder engagement in human rights due diligence. And the way it is structured is that you first have the rationale. So which includes our findings from the benchmark, including the statistics and why it is important as a topic, and then key questions to ask companies about the topic. Then under the questions, you have a box with the corresponding indicators from our methodology. We can move to the next slide, please. And a bit more on the gender guidance. So the questions are based on our 2023 benchmark covering 2 sectors, as well as the gender assessment that I mentioned. It covers 1,000 companies across 10 industries. So the questions that you have here are based on the insights that we have on over 1,000 companies. And it also includes the leading practice documents, as I mentioned. It follows a similar structure to the CHRB one, so I won't repeat everything. But what you can see on the slide is our key finding on violence and harassment. And below that, you will have a set of questions related to own operation, supply chain. So the questions are covering different topics in subsections. So you can go into more depth when you engage with companies. I will share a bit more on the leading practice documents and how that could be used. So I mentioned that we have those. I know a lot of investors always ask me for leading practices and kind of good practice examples that they could use in their engagement with companies. So we decided to embed these documents in the investor guidance. They are downloadable Excels that include the highest scoring companies on each of our indicators in the gender benchmark and the CHRB. So what do the leading practice documents include? So they include the topic and the indicator number. They include the company name, the sector, and reasoning. So why the company met the indicator requirements and links to relevant disclosures. So it gives you the underlying data as well as the rationale of why the company performed well on a specific requirement. How to use the document. So as I mentioned in my previous slides, there are corresponding indicator numbers available below the assessment questions in the guidance. You can cross-reference these for the topics relevant to your engagement and filter the Excel per company sector. So you can really play with that Excel and use it in a way that suits your engagement activities. I will share one more slide. Last one, please. Great. So I just want to share more about ways that you could work with us. So if you want to work with WBA more closely, there are a couple of ways to do so. So first, for several years now, we worked with the Investor Alliance, with Rebecca and Asaba on coordinated corporate engagement based on CHRB results. We've been targeting companies that scored 0 on human rights due diligence. And then if you want to work more on gender with us, you can join WBA's Collective Impact Coalition on Violence and Harassment that is based on our gender benchmark result. The Collective Impact Coalition is a time-bound coalition of global multi-stakeholders, including investors who have influence over companies. And we have an open meeting on June 4th. I will share more information with Rebecca to communicate with you in the coming days. So I'll end it here. I just really hope that the investor guidance document will be useful for your work. And I will now pass it back to Rebecca. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Talia. That's been really useful. Thanks so much. Just quickly, and again, I want to encourage folks, if you have any questions that come up, to go ahead and put them in the chat a while. But just 2 things I was going to say. If there's any information about that June 4th Collective Impact Coalition meeting, feel free to also put that in the chat, but also happy to circulate that. And just one question, just with regards to the sector-specific risk, and because as you pointed out, there's 5 sectors that are being assessed through the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. How does that look in the guidance? Is that also, are you identifying particular human rights issues for those sectors? And are there questions to those issues? Could you just maybe just elaborate a little bit on that one?
Sure, of course. So exactly that. And we have the researcher that worked on drafting the document here, if she wants to come in as well, Jill, but not putting anyone on the spot. So it's exactly what you said. We will have the sector and then the key risks that we've identified in our methodology. So if it's ICT, for example, there will be forced labor, there will be minimal resourcing, and then you will have the questions that investors could ask on those specific topics. So It's not necessarily key findings, but it is key risks for the sector that we thought it's important to address in the document. And that could be used, I mean, the whole document could be used beyond with companies that are maybe not in scope of our benchmark. So it could be used in any kind of companies that operate in those sectors.
Yeah, excellent point. And those are also then linked to indicators as well, then the questions.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Jill or Sanjini, did you want to add anything to that? Okay, well, there may be more questions coming in then during the Q&A. For now, why don't I turn things over? We're going to first hear from Benjamin talking a little bit about his experience engaging with companies on their human rights performance. Over to you. Thanks for being here today.
Hi there. Hi. Can you hear me all right? Okay. Thank you. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca and Talia. I think it must be said that the CHRB index is extremely valuable, that there's very little standardized human rights data out there, especially when looking at some of the things that the ESG research firms are doing or the proxy advisors are doing. So far, to kind of gauge how a company is doing, we're kind of relying on, we're accounting for the different controversies that might appear. So we're looking backwards, and
Oh, Benjamin, I think you went on mute accidentally. There we go. Okay.
kicked out for a second there, sorry. So there's no standardized data, so it's great to have this resource. Also, I think this is something that is being addressed today, this lack of data. There is an initiative out there today, I'd like to mention it, the Investor Initiative on Human Rights Data, which is being driven by the Church of England. I think this is really important. They're targeting 8 different ESG service providers to, really highlight this issue. And this is a big issue for us as a responsible investor, because we do have big discrepancies between some of the companies that are very well ranked out there, and that we might be, heavily underweight or might be completely excluding because of the harm they're doing to human rights. So it's sometimes very hard to explain that to some of our clients. So having the CHRB gives us a very granular human rights assessment of companies. It's really special. It's research based. It's independent. It's recognized. So it's a very solid research when we're talking to companies, or or just when we're using this in our ESG research. It's a great basis for engagement, because whatever the level of greenwashing that's out there, when we talk to some of these companies in the index, they hate to be considered as laggards. So it's we can have those conversations with them, and also it gives us this level of expertise. Today we can't just get on a call with a large corporation and just expect them to simply do better on human rights. We have to get in front of them with expertise. We have to do gap analysis before those calls. We have to define what's best practice. So this resource that Tanya is giving us today is really crucial. For example, we can call a company up and say, your competitor has put in place this ethical committee. They have access to external experts. Why don't you have it? When are you going to have it? Let's talk about this. I can give you an example. Through this forum of the Investor Alliance on Human Rights, we're talking to several companies on forced labor. One company, one Chinese solar module manufacturer, was very difficult to engage, and the conversation was really blocked. It didn't want to speak to us anymore, and we managed to get back into them, and by doing a presentation, by showing them best practice. And we went in, a few of us, and we showed them what was being done out there, and that got them talking again. That was Sorry, I get kicked out a little bit. Sorry, I get kicked out.
We can hear you again, though. Just go ahead.
Yeah.
You were
Yeah,
just saying
so
with a Chinese solar company showing best practice, got you
yeah,
back in.
Sorry. So yeah, really important to to keep encouraging and accompanying companies by showing these best practice. I think this Excel document that Talia was mentioning earlier on is one of the best thing I've seen in the past year. Certainly, it's a gold mine. You've got 150 lines of best practice with all these comments and URLs that you can simply take them, put them in front of companies. So I think that's really important. I think also regulation is coming. That's going to affect what our conversations with companies on human rights. Obviously, you've got CSRD, CSDDD. We're seeing some of the German companies that are now publishing their first reports for the new Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. That's all coming out. So that's going to be also good subjects for engagement. How you prepared for this? How far are you going to go down into your supply chain? What are the challenges you're getting? I think these are also interesting things that are happening today. I'll leave it there and leave it open for questions.
Thanks, Benjamin. And we'll maybe do a round of questions with everybody after we're done with the presentation from Amy as well. But I just wanted to ask you one immediate follow-up, because I found your the story you relayed about your engagement with the Chinese company very interesting, and and how bringing in the best practice made them more open for discussion and dialogue. And I'm just curious, because certainly the CHRB has put out best practice data out there and has encouraged companies to engage with it, on what they're doing and on best practice. So what do you think have been some of the barriers to doing that? Did it need to have kind of something that the regulation coming down the pike to kind of move companies? I mean, what did you think, in your view, were the barriers that prevented the company from initially wanting to engage with you?
I think it's I mean, that topic of forced labor is obviously very political. We're talking to quite a lot of companies again today, maybe in the auto sector, about that issue in the auto supply chain. I think there is fear, of maybe boycotts going on. If you're disclosing too much on China, for example, so that is obviously a touchy subject. But I think you can have those conversations on calls with company, rather than expect them to have very deep disclosures. So yeah, I think we've just got to get on the phone and speak to these people.
Great, thank you. Okay, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Amy. And again, I encourage everyone, if you have questions, you can either go off chat, or if you off mute in a second here, or you can put those questions in the chat function. Amy, over to you to talk to us a little bit about your experience engaging with companies on gender.
Yeah, and I might, I don't want to thank you, Benjamin, for your comments and for the guiding documents as well. I will just upvote a lot of what Benjamin said already, but I also think, speaking a little bit to Boston Commons history, we are, and also focusing a little bit on the gender benchmark, which we think is a really positive value add, in addition to the work that we're also doing on CHRB and utilizing the other benchmarks. But so Boston Common, as many of you know, is a women-founded organization. We've been around for 20 years, and we've been talking about our philosophy, investing at the intersection of social change and financial return for quite some time. And gender has been a really core piece of our DNA. So on the social change side, we get that women are the hardest hit by the interconnected crises of climate change, human well-being, among other issues. And on the financial return side, we really believe that there's sort of a lost opportunity if companies aren't acknowledging gender dynamics of their full value chain. And so as a fundamental investor, we refuse to sort of put gender and human rights in silos, and instead prioritize sort of the relevant aspects across the value chain. And so we're out there talking about this issue, specifically gender, quite often. Our founder, Gita Iyer, has published many articles on the idea of making gender visible. We have sort of published our own investor guidance in 2022 that argues that a full value chain approach is absolutely essential. And we've used that in policy engagements with, the underpinning that is now of the EU's Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. We've used it in corporate conversations. But what has been missing and what we're really excited about these benchmarks is we really get that we can't do this alone, right? We need friends in this space in order to improve data sets, really improve the standards, as Benjamin already mentioned. And we feel that this now, the moment of now, is incredibly important as companies, we see companies sort of shying away from disclosing more detail on human rights. And specifically sort of the gender and diversity dynamics in the supply chain. And at the same time, regulatory efforts in Europe and the CHRB are asking for more. And so we really think it's an important moment to have this publicly available benchmark to help improve standards and really, show the great work that has been done, because I agree that it's a gold mine. Around what are the leading practice examples that we can surface in company conversations, and understanding that this is still a largely, under-recognized space that needs us to collectively shine a light on gender dynamics. We think that there's more work to be done, and so even the best practice examples, we can find ways to do better and encourage companies to do better. And so I'll just highlight a couple of points, and then I think it'd be great to have more people chime in on their experiences. So we get that when we've written about how gender externalities are far from being priced in, yet they relentlessly persist and indeed incur societal costs. We need data, we need partnerships, we need collaborations in order to do better. Is kind of our view, our organizational view. We also, what I like about some of the examples is we also need just basics like disaggregated data to help us understand, not only commitments and policies, but, what is the gender turnover? What is the percentage of females, promoted? What is the level of absenteeism? There's some like very basic data that if we have gender disaggregated data in the supply chain, it'll help us ask better questions. And so that basic ask is even a step in the right direction, and it's not generally widely available. Focusing a little bit on some of our company examples, I will just name a couple quickly. So I guess one, just to balance Benjamin's sort of Chinese solar example, is we're also dealing with some pretty complex supply chains. And so we would really underscore the importance of specifically a gender focus in the food and ag space, where we have engaged with grocers and food producers around how to sort of raise the bar for better disclosure and how to really think about that full value chain approach, inclusive of supply chains that are, have some very inherent challenges. So in the grocers that we've engaged on human rights issues, they're eligible for, emerging standards under human rights due diligence and CHRB. They have protocols in place that work very well within their direct operations, such as grievance mechanisms, speak up lines. But those mechanisms don't work as well when translated to the supply chain that has, traceability issues, intermediation of supply chains, labor contractors, when you actually get to that beyond tier 1 space where gender dynamics in this case are widespread, we think. And so WBA has some great KPIs that we can help lift that issue, shine a light on those darker corners of the supply chain, which we think will be incredibly important. And, ask more specific questions about, what is the hurdle to disclosure in those areas of the supply chain? And, it might range from something as simple as the technology portal. When you're dealing with lack of trust in a, disintermediated supply chain, you're probably not going to get a worker on the field to download an app that's owned by a global grocer that is the employer of your employer. How do we have sort of even the most simple fixes within to sort of make those grievance mechanisms, red flags, processes internally be more applicable to the supply chain? And then I'll offer one more example. In food and ag, I think we see some great examples in the best practice document of of companies that are, you know, consumer facing companies, but are sourcing commodities such as cocoa or others that we know have gender issues, you know, deeper in the supply chain. How do we think about using worker voice? And I think there's a lot of good stuff here in the benchmark, incorporating worker voice to really get at the issues that are relevant in a place. Oftentimes we see more localized impacts and more localized hurdles to progress. So in the cocoa supply chain, we know from stakeholders that, you know, the issue oftentimes is more of a land tenure system that is really biased against women. And so how do we think about overcoming that hurdle? And if we know that that's the issue, then no financial incentive program or financial literacy training is going to help overcome the hurdle that is, you know, land tenure issues of women gifted land that's frankly less productive. So I guess so disclosure is huge. We love that this benchmark is highlighting disclosure. We really appreciate that it's pinpointing issues like violence and harassment, which are pervasive, but have largely been under-recognized and under-reported. And then really thinking about worker voice is a very important element, especially when we're getting to some of these more localized nuances of supply chain dynamics that have been for a long time had gender biases that we need to sort of uncover.
Thanks, Amy. That's terrific. And I really like how you're looking at the intersectionality of some of these human rights issues. Like you gave the example between, you know, women's rights and the land tenure issue. It really speaks to the fact that you do need to engage with women at a very localized level as well to understand the complexity of the issues. That's a really good point. Okay, so we are very much on schedule. Appreciate that. Everyone's keeping us moving forward. But we do have now some time where we can really dig a little bit deeper into some of these examples. And I would encourage, you know, we've got a fairly sizable audience here for others to also share their experiences. You know, if you're an investor in the investor space, engaging with companies on their human rights performance, or particularly, you know, with regards to the issue of women's rights, gender rights. Or also if you're in the civil society space, you know, how might this data be useful for you as well? That's coming from the corporate human rights benchmark or the gender assessment, and you know, how might these leading practice examples might feature? You know, we heard from Benjamin that, you know, companies are eager to hear about leading practice. How might these leading practices also feature in the advocacy that you're doing? Would love to open it up, and feel free to, you know, raise your hand and we'll call on you. You can come off mute. Well, while I wait a moment for everyone to kind of think about what they might want to ask, I'll wait for the brave person to be first to ask. I'm going to actually turn for a second because we do have two research analysts here from the WBA, Sanjini and Jill, and I'm just curious, you know, in terms of how you developed this guidance. You know, how did you, for example, approach determining what were some of the best questions to ask of companies with regards to some of the key findings? Did you feel that there were we're dealing with two different guidance documents here, but we were talking about the intersectionality of rights. Where do you see in the key findings kind of points of overlap in terms of how potentially investors want to approach companies? And just, I don't know which one of you maybe wants to jump in first and share a little bit about the development of the guidance. Jill, I saw you went off mute.
Yeah, I don't mind. Thanks. I think the process is generally very similar to, we also do key findings in our insights report, so definitely looking very similarly at our data set and what jumps out. I think for this guidance, what I think was really helpful for, at least for the CHRB, is that we have quite a big data set in terms of also 5 years now already. So we looked at companies last year which performed much better over the 5 years, so the fastest improvers as opposed to the laggards, and then really try to identify what practices they actually implemented. And the CHRB is quite detailed, as you have seen. We can really separate the elements quite detailed, so we can really see what companies can do. And I think based on that, I really formed some of the questions. So they're really, the guidance is really focused on what we saw as like key enablers. And I think the overlap with gender, came in a lot for the sector risks, because gender is included in the CHRB for some sectors like food and agriculture, as was also just mentioned. That's where we see gender as a risk, and then we have that overlap. But I think the gender guidance goes much deeper into that, so I will pass also to Sanjini.
Thanks, Jill. Sanjini, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jill. I agree. The way gender has structured it is also looking at, like, I would like to highlight supply chain elements. We found in our results and assessments of companies that disclosure on supply chain is really minimal. For instance, only I think there are 3 companies which report on number of women in supply chain. So I feel like what we have additionally tried to do, going beyond the workplace and adding that element of supply chain, which is key, another heart of what we do at WBA, to see the impact which actually is there on people, because the decisions which are taken by the investors are going to ultimately have an impact on somebody in a factory that's in India. So I feel like that's what I wanted to highlight, apart from what Jill mentioned, like supply chain elements, and also gender also looked at companies like where they're not performed well. So not just looking at the best performance practices, but also where like disclosure was minimal, and that's why those questions need to be asked.
Great, thank you. And I see we have Celie Moore asking questions. Celie, do you want me just to read this out, or did you like to go off mute and ask the questions yourselves?
I can ask them.
Fantastic, thanks so much.
Sure. My first question was whether there are indicators integrated into either guide that look at, if you will, the reality of it, right? As opposed to just a check mark, there is this policy, there is this process, but how the workers are experiencing and perceiving the efficacy and, political will, if you will, of the corporations. And then I guess just to follow up on the last point that was made, maybe elaborate a bit more why human rights and gender were sort of separated out into 2 separate guides. I mean, I can imagine what the pros and cons are, but also the notion that having one guide might be easier in negotiating with with companies, and just making sure that the indicators are sufficiently gendered. But these were my 2 questions. Thank you.
Happy to jump in, Rebecca, and Sanjini and Jill, if you want to add anything, please do. So your first question, I think that's the biggest challenge when you benchmark companies, because you're looking at publicly available information on companies' disclosure. So we have indicators that try to get as close as possible to performance. For example, for some of the supply chain indicators, we're looking at how companies describe the way they work with suppliers on the issues and how they track progress over time on a specific negative impact or risk. For the CHRB, we also have a section that looks at allegations made against companies and how companies responded to those allegations, which I think gets us closer to kind of impact on the ground than the other sections of the methodology. But obviously, it's something that is very difficult to capture in a benchmark that is based on company disclosures. So yeah, just being very honest about the limitations of what we can and can cover in a benchmark. But what we are really trying to do is have process-oriented indicators that are more about how companies describe the processes they have in place to address risks versus policy commitments. This is why we have in the methodology different sections covering the different aspects of companies' performance. I can address the second question unless Jill or Sanjini, you want to jump in and add anything. Great. Yeah, so great question. I think the simple answer is that it would have been a very long document. The reason we divided the 2 is because there's just so many indicators and key findings from the benchmarks, from the gender and the corporate human rights benchmark, that we had to divide it in order to just have more detailed engagement questions. Obviously, when we're talking about violence and harassment, it is a human right to begin with a gender lens. So we always keep that in mind. And this is why we published the 2 together and not separately, because we do see it as 2 documents that could be used simultaneously by investors. But a very kind of straightforward answer is that it would have been a very long document, and it was just a way for us to make it more maybe readable for users to separate the two.
Thanks, Talia.
And I can just add to that I sort of share that sometimes at Boston Common of like which benchmark do we lift in which conversation, but I think the interconnectedness of them is really important, and depending on the company's progress in this space, if they have a lot of the strong rankings under human rights, that might be the more appropriate time to sort of press on gender dynamics in the supply chain. And so I would just say we lift those. The benchmarks are useful to have sort of the comparative lens on the deeper issue of gender, and then be able to zoom out to say, how is the company responding also to the human rights consideration, which we see as sort of a little bit more of a general and overarching benchmark to use.
And Amy, just to follow up on that question, or on that what you just said, I have a question for you. So is there, you clearly identified that there are certainly a handful of companies that are better than others in terms of kind of looking at gender throughout their value chain. And, I'm wondering, I guess, what motivates those companies? There's something common to those companies that you've seen that makes them willing to pay attention to the gender issue. And is there a kind of sequencing? Like, is it first they have to think about human rights more broadly, and then they might focus in on gender? Or is it potentially the other way around? They become aware of gender, but then see it's an intersectional issue with other human rights issues? Or maybe there's no pattern at all. I don't know. What do you see any kind of consistency around the leaders who are really getting their heads wrapped around gender issues?
Yeah, and I'll also call on Benjamin to weigh in as well, because I think we probably all have different experiences engaging companies. I mean, I would say, so geography does kind of matter in this case. Actually, my colleague Lauren Compera is on a flight right now to head to Japan, where she's surfacing a lot of gender dynamics and, with Japanese companies. And in those cases, you don't always have, we find it to be very important to sort of be in person, where we think we get more leverage, more nuance to the conversation. So that's sort of one thing. And then secondly, I would say certain sectors also have are ahead of others just because they've had, frankly, more problems historically, so they're sort of better at speaking to these issues. So apparel is a good example of that, which has had I feel like the bar has already been sort of risen for many apparel companies, and I think we can push them further on issues like violence and harassment in the workplace. But I would say, and then emerging regulation. I think one of the ways that we use the investor guidance that I discussed is around really thinking about gender aspects of human rights due diligence. As an important piece of the puzzle, where we found that the word gender was sort of largely absent from a lot of the emerging standards, and that was a problem. But we think that the emerging regulation can help raise the bar. But the gender piece of the puzzle is both pervasive and undercounted and underrepresented, we think, and we need to continue to sort of lift that in. So I would say leaders can be sometimes deceiving, because I think that those who speak better about it probably have a more checkered history. And then those that aren't really acknowledging the issue as well might not be, fully comprehending sort of the gender impacts of their full supply chain. And that's where I would put, more food and ag, top of mind as we think about needing to really get at the traceability question to really understand the full gender dynamics, deeper in the supply chain. I don't know if that really answered your question, but Benjamin, anything else to add? I think it's a really good question that we have to keep thinking about.
Yeah, so my experience on engaging on gender has been very European focused, and it's been through those 30% clubs that are like pretty active today, and like certainly in France and Germany that we're part of, and so we're really addressing it. So those companies we're talking to are really kind of addressing that in their own workforce. They're doing very little in the supply chain, unfortunately, and it's very number driven today, rather than trying to get overall maybe equality or inclusion. equity or inclusion rather. So so I think that's where I think the work must come, is really down in the supply chain, because there's otherwise we're not addressing the right the right issue here.
Makes a lot of sense. Does anyone else want to ask a question in relation to these issues? Otherwise, I'll jump in with building on something that Celie mentioned. I have a question myself, and it's about the relationship and of trying to understand a company's policies and processes that they have in place, but then also understanding concretely what those look like in terms of performance on the ground and the actual impacts. And, I found it interesting because on the one hand, when Benjamin opened up, he talked about the fact that a lot of the ESG data that he's getting is, first of all, very short on relaying what kind of policies and practices companies have in place with regards to doing the necessary human rights due diligence and making the commitments they need to respect human rights. At the same time, I'm going to guess are pretty heavy in terms of controversies, rating companies based on particular bad incidents that have happened, right? Whereas then we've heard from the WBA team that, they can very well look to see what's publicly available in terms of policies and processes, but, are trying to better integrate, also taking into account particular incidents that happen. And I'm wondering, and then we've also heard, I think, Amy, you said that, ironically, it's some of the companies that have had some of the biggest incidents and problems are the ones who seem to be making a lot of progress. So it kind of leaves me in my mind, I'm hearing almost two different things at once, like we want to know better about performance, but we also need to look at some of the systems that companies have in place that will hopefully allow them to improve over time, but we need to still figure out if those are actually working or not. So I don't know if any of you have thoughts about kind of how to think about that balance between incidents and controversies and policies and processes when looking at a company and trying to get a holistic picture if they're on the right path or not. Talia, I see you going off mute, so please do jump in.
Amy, please go ahead. I'll
Or
come in
Amy,
after.
yes, any of you. Or anyone else in the audience, please do feel free. Don't be shy.
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep it short because I'm really curious to hear the WBA's approach to this too. I mean, progress is progress. Like, I think sometimes, following a controversy, if we can use that moment to press a company to say this issue is material, there is reputational risk associated with this issue, even just speak in the company's terms and highlight. I do feel like it is a problem that oftentimes when we learn about things like violence and harassment, it is almost too late. The damage has been done. And I think we worry a little bit about kind of the zero tolerance effect that buyers have, although that's a step in the right direction to state that you are not tolerant of these, human rights violations in the supply chain. Is that actually just creating a culture of hiding and covering up some of these issues as opposed to transparency and disclosure in a world where we know that this is an issue, right? And so I would say, even for the companies that are, potentially covering up a checkered past, things like the WBA help us get at, how do you get beyond just the statement of you care about this issue, and are you providing the disclosure to help us ask better questions? And that's progress in and of itself. But we have to, I think, force ourselves as investors to sort of move beyond the check the box and really try and understand what's under the hood. Talia, anything from your perspective?
Yeah, so very much linked to this, I think we had a key finding that repeats itself in different versions over the years, where we see that companies add to their supplier codes of conduct or contractual agreements if it comes to forced labor or prohibition of forced labor or living wage requirements, etc. So the majority of companies already include those in their contractual agreements, but when we're looking at how companies work on these topics with their suppliers or provide help to work on this topic, support in the form of training or programs or in other ways, it drops to less than a quarter of companies that actually do that and try to support their suppliers in improving on these topics. And then when we look at tracking progress, I think it's less than 3% of companies that track progress on these issues in their supply chain. So I think what we try to do in the benchmark is exactly as you said, Amy, to get away from that simple kind of commitment statement or requirement that companies incorporate into contractual agreements, and look at the companies that support suppliers and work with them on these areas. Because oftentimes, and this is one of the things that came out from a workshop that we held in Bangladesh, is that if you just place these requirements on suppliers and you don't support them, then it prevents them from maybe reporting when issues arise. So it creates kind of an environment where they're afraid to kind of tell the company that actually we have an issue with violence and harassment and we need support on that, or we have X number of complaints filed in our grievance mechanism. So I think this is one of the key findings that over the years repeats itself with the different sectors that we benchmark.
Oswald, do you want to jump in on this as well?
Actually, Talia just said it. It was on the grievance, mechanisms and the whistleblowing programs. We need better disclosure on that, and we want to see proper numbers, because if I don't know, I'm thinking like automakers right now. I'm deep into auto industry right now, but companies with 10,000 suppliers that tell you that their whistleblower program has kind of had 10 alerts. It just doesn't make any sense. We want to see these things ringing. We want to see we want to see hundreds of alerts. We want to see where they come from, which countries, which material, which subjects. So we need to see those disclosures, and that's great for investors to kind of touch and feel where the risks are, where the harm is being done, and companies have to be more open on that.
And maybe if I could quickly add something, Rebecca, we're also looking at serious allegations made against companies. And I think what differentiates maybe the CHRB methodology from any kind of flag system that investors might have on companies is that we're looking at how companies responded to the serious allegations. So again, we're a very process-oriented benchmark. So I think that most of the multinational companies will have serious allegations and human rights negative impacts arise in their supply chains or own operations. What we're interested in is to see that there is a system in place to address these cases as they come up. So again, we're really looking at the systems that companies have in place to address negative human rights impacts. I think, yeah, just to summarize.
Yes, I wanted to just add to that because just also what Talia said, like, yeah, we assess serious allegations. And I think I come from previously, I did research for an ESG data provider. So it's kind of interesting to see the differences there, working very much on controversies. And I think a really big difference between what, for example, we look at and sometimes ESG data controversies focused data tends to look at is the remedy also, and having a rights holder centric remedy in response to a serious allegation. And I think that's something that investors could push on more, which is kind of going further than just a response and also just the policies that have adapted, which I think, as we're all saying, we see that companies who have a lot of serious allegations actually have a lot of policies in place later, and they generally tend to also perform better, companies that have been under pressure. But I think having a rights holder centric approach to these kind of controversies and allegations is also very important.
Thank you. So that's a very good point. And what do you think, just in what you've seen in terms of having to assess companies and how they're responding and trying to address incidents? What do you see? Because you are, as I understand it, using basically publicly available data. Is that correct? Even for the controversies, right? Or the incidents. And so is it that companies maybe don't disclose enough so that you can understand better whether they're taking the appropriate steps to remediate a harm? Like, what do you see as some of the limitations in the data that you have at your disposal that's coming from companies in terms of what they're disclosing?
Yes, I think whether it's publicly available is always an issue, because also for controversies, you get into a lot of legal territory and there's sometimes a lot of things that companies can't disclose. And that's why I think investors play a very important role, because I feel companies are much more open to investors than they are to a party like us, where they tend to be a bit more hesitant to release this kind of information. So I think for us, this disclosure element is always a limitation in assessing whether the response and also whether the remedy has been given, because that is sometimes confidential information. And I think this is where investors actually play a really big role, because they have often more access to this kind of information and are able to push companies a lot more. I don't know if Talia maybe has something to add here as well.
I don't know about access, but Ben and Amy, you can share more, but at least you can get on a call and ask the company about it. Yeah.
And hopefully also encourage them to indeed disclose more about their grievance processes. And even if they can't, for legal reasons, disclose specifics, at least to disclose higher level data in terms of, like, as Benjamin pointed out, like, how many incidents are you receiving? How are they being resolved? What remedy might perhaps you have provided in certain incidents? I think even just that kind of high level data would be a big step forward to where we are now, for sure.
Exactly, and sometimes we also accept similar responses. So if you in a certain category, as opposed to just like on this very specific thing, on the very specific issue that's at hand. So I think we tend to think that companies sometimes feel like when they release information, it can be seen as a negative, specifically if it's about a serious allegation. And I think that's kind of what Benjamin is also saying. But actually, we want to see more data, and that's something I think an investor can share in a very like good way, as opposed to when we're always asking for more data as well.
Excellent. And I see there's one point here in the chat function from Elizabeth Andvig. Phrasing is a good point. Increasing the capacity of business relationships within the supply chain is also part of the updates to the OECD's responsible business conduct guidelines. And for sure, I think we certainly want to avoid kind of that risk displacement down the supply chain and encourage a more positive working relationship between brands and their suppliers, or companies and their suppliers. I guess one question to that briefly, both Amy and Benjamin, I mean, for investors, I think obviously you want to see very much that companies are addressing their salient human rights risks, but inevitably you're also concerned about the material impacts of when those risks are not sufficiently addressed. And I'm wondering, is there potentially any risk for companies in trying to form a more stable, longer term relationship with some of their suppliers, to really, at what Talia was getting at, to really help their suppliers improve the situation, be it on a farm or in a factory somewhere? I mean, or does that potentially even come with its own risks to have that kind of longer term relationship with suppliers?
I can try something. So a lot of what we're hearing today is around onshoring and kind of diversification of supply chains in order to avoid problems in the supply chain, like we've seen during COVID, or more political issues, like what the US is trying to do, like kind of onshoring kind of more industrial production. So that's certainly happening right now. You're clearly seeing that with it's becoming, it feels like, rather than having one strong relationship, companies prefer to have something a bit more closer to home. That's something I'm very much seeing in a more kind of industrial sectors.
Amy, did you want to jump in on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately my answer was unsatisfactory, which is it does sort of depend. I think we have a lot of, for example, apparel companies that have these deep long-term relationships with contractual, long-term relationships with suppliers, and they sort of value that piece. But they've historically been really closed to disclosing their supply chain relationship. And on the flip side of that, you have, more opportunistic buyers that have 21,000 suppliers and they're everywhere, and that's very much, they like that agility. And so there's pros and cons to each approach. I would say that emerging disclosure is actually making that kind of deep but black box approach to supply chain engagement less applicable, in my experience with apparel companies, because the table stakes now is disclosure, right? You have to disclose your supply chain, and so you can no longer keep that secret. And so perhaps there's something there that allows for the marrying of kind of longer term and deeper relationships where there are probably financial benefits to that longevity and lower turnover and lower, lower training costs, whatever it might be. But we still have the opportunistic buyer problem that is always going to prioritize sort of rapidly shifting business models and supply chains to get the latest and cheapest stuff. And that's a problem with this type of with this ask, I think, that we can't avoid.
Well, I'm noticing we're at time,
Yeah.
so I just want to say a big thank you to all of our presenters today. Encourage everyone to look at the guidance. There are some really useful questions there, as well as the leading practices document. Use that in your engagements, use that in your advocacy. I hope it's okay. I see there was just one question that came in at the last minute we weren't able to answer. Hopefully it's okay for me to encourage folks to reach out to you, Talia, to answer those questions that we weren't able to get to today. And thanks again, everyone. This recording will be made available if you want to share it or review anything that was discussed today. If you're interested in the corporate human rights benchmark engagement, do reach out to us. If you're interested in the KIC, the gender KIC, then please do reach out to Talia as well. Take care, everybody, and thank you for being here. Bye-bye.
Thank you.